The air in the room wasn't just stale, it was heavy, pressing down on the shoulders of the two men sitting across from one another like a physical weight. It smelled of old varnish, stale tobacco, and the distinct metallic scent of ozone that comes before a lightning strike. Outside, the Harlem winter of 1965 was doing its best to freeze the blood in the veins of the city. The wind whipped off the Hudson, cutting through the alleyways of 116th Street like a razor, rattling the single pane of glass in the window frame. But inside, the temperature was rising with every second of silence. There was no hum of a refrigerator, no ticking clock. The world outside had ceased to exist. The only sound was the rhythmic, almost imperceptible tapping of a finger against the scarred wood of a mahogany table. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't a nervous tick, it was a metronome, a signal of patience, or perhaps a countdown. The man doing the tapping didn't look at his finger. He looked straight ahead, his eyes hooded, unreadable dark pools that had seen the rise and fall of empires on these very streets. He sat with the stillness of a statue carved from obsidian. He wore a suit that cost more than most men in this zip code made in a year, Italian silk tailored to hide the scar on his shoulder and the revolver at his hip. Yet he wore it with the casual indifference of someone who didn't need clothes to command respect. He was still, utterly, terrifyingly still. Across from him sat a younger man, taller, lankier, with glasses that caught the dim light of the single lamp in the corner. This second man was usually a firebrand, a voice that could shake stadiums, a man whose rhetoric made police commissioners sweat in their sleep and politicians rewrite their speeches. He was the lightning rod of a nation. But tonight, here, in this shadow, he was quiet. He was listening. His hands were clasped tight in his lap, the knuckles white, betraying the exhaustion that his posture tried to hide. They weren't supposed to be here. If the men in the nondescript sedans parked 3 blocks away, the men with the gray suits and the telephoto lenses knew this meeting was happening, they would have kicked down the door before the coffee had finished pouring. They would have called in the tactical teams. If the rivals on the street, the young wolves looking to make a name for themselves, knew these two forces of nature were breathing the same air in a private room, the balance of power in New York would have shifted overnight. It would have been open war. But nobody knew, just them. And the silence stretched, pulling tight like a piano wire across a throat, vibrating with the things left unsaid. The older man stopped tapping. The silence suddenly became louder. He leaned forward just an inch into the circle of light. The younger man shifted, his jaw tight, a bead of sweat tracing a jagged line down his temple despite the chill in the room. The older man spoke, and his voice was low, a rumble of gravel and velvet that seemed to come from the floorboards rather than his throat. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't ask how the family was. He didn't ask about the weather. He simply said, "They are going to kill you, Red, and they are going to do it before the snow melts." The sentence hung there, suspending time. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a guess. It was a weather report, a certainty. It was stated with the same factual finality as gravity. The younger man adjusted his glasses, his eyes flashing behind the lenses with a mix of defiance, exhaustion, and a terrible dawning resignation. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to cite scripture, perhaps to quote a law, perhaps to stand on principle, but the older man raised a single manicured hand. "Don't preach to me, not tonight. Tonight isn't about God. It isn't about the white man. It isn't about the movement. It's about arithmetic. You have 0 guns. They have an army. I can change the math. If you're drawn to the untold power stories of Harlem and the men who ruled without noise, you're already in the right place. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Most people think they know how this story goes. They think they know the players. They have read the biographies that talk about civil rights and organized crime as if they were two separate planets orbiting different suns. They have seen the movies that show the shouting matches and the public speeches, but the history books, the ones approved for the classrooms and the libraries, they never told this part. They couldn't. The files on this specific night, on this specific conversation, were either never written down or they were burned in an incinerator in the basement of a federal building decades ago. J. Edgar Hoover didn't want you to know this meeting happened. The NYPD Intelligence Division didn't want you to know, because this meeting challenged the very foundation of their control. The official narrative wants you to believe that the street and the pulpit were enemies, that the gangster and the minister had nothing in common but the color of their skin and the neighborhood on their mail. That is a lie. It is a comfortable fiction designed to keep you from understanding how power actually works when the cameras are turned off. The truth is much more dangerous. The truth is that the man they called the Godfather of Harlem and the man they called the Prince of the Nation were not strangers. They were two sides of the same coin, spun in the air by a country that didn't want either of them to land. And on this night, the coin was still spinning. What happened in this room wouldn't just determine who lived or died. It would change the psychology of resistance in America. It would rewrite the rules of loyalty. It would establish a code that the streets still whisper about today. But to understand why a crime lord, a man who dealt in vice, numbers, and hard consequences, would risk his empire to save a man who publicly denounced crime, you have to strip away the titles. You have to forget Bumpy and Malcolm X for a moment. You have to look at the terrified boys inside the men. You have to go back to a time before the suits, before the fame, when survival wasn't a political statement. It was just about eating. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson wasn't born a king. He was forged in the fires of a segregated America. He was a man of high intellect in a world that only valued brute strength. He was a chess player in a boxing ring. He read Nietzsche and Machiavelli by candlelight while other men were sharpening knives. He learned early that the loudest man in the room is usually the first one to get hit. He learned that fear was a currency more stable than gold, but love, loyalty born of genuine care, was the only thing that could buy you a future. He carried a jagged pride, a sensitivity that he hid behind a wall of stone. He wrote poetry that nobody saw. He played the long game, and he watched. He watched how the system broke men who tried to stand up, how it crushed the loud ones, the proud ones, and he decided he wouldn't stand up in their way. He would build his own floor, higher than everyone else's. He would build a kingdom where the police had to knock before entering. And the other man? Before he was the terrifying prophet of a new age, before the bow ties and the podiums, he was Detroit Red. Bumpy remembered Detroit Red. He remembered the lanky kid with the conked red hair, the zoot suits, the hustle in his step. He was a kid running numbers, selling smoke, steering clear of the sharks while trying to look like one. They shared a DNA of the pavement. They knew the smell of a precinct holding cell, that mix of bleach and despair. They knew the hollow ache of being invisible to the world outside of Harlem. When Malcolm looked at Bumpy, he didn't just see a gangster. He saw a father figure. He saw a man who had survived the fire that consumed so many others. He saw a man who walked through white downtown banks with his head held high, demanding respect not with a sign, but with a gaze that said, "Touch me, and you die." When Bumpy looked at Malcolm, even back then, he saw the potential he had traded away. He saw the fire. He saw a voice that could say the things Bumpy could only whisper in back rooms. He saw a son. There was a love there, a complicated, unspoken, rugged love that men of that era didn't have the vocabulary to express. It wasn't about business, it was about recognition. "I see you," their silence said. "I know what it cost you to get here. I know the demons you fight because I fight them too." But the world was changing. The ground was shifting beneath their feet in 1965. The tectonic plates of history were grinding together, and Malcolm was standing right on the fault line. Malcolm had left the Nation of Islam. He had walked away from the protection, the hierarchy, the structure that had defined him. He was a man alone on an island, surrounded by sharks that he had once called brothers. The threats weren't subtle anymore. They weren't whispers. Phone calls in the middle of the night, heavy breathing and then a click. Dead animals left on the doorstep of his home in Queens, a message for his wife Betty and his children. Cars trailing him to the airport, engines idling just loud enough to be heard. The psychological pressure was designed to break him, to make him look over his shoulder until his neck snapped from the tension. The FBI was watching, logging every threat, but doing nothing to stop them. They were waiting for the inevitable. They were creating the vacuum for violence to happen. Bumpy watched this from his perch on 116th Street. He saw the wolves circling. He knew the smell of a hit. He had ordered enough of them to recognize the cadence, the rhythm of a murder before it happens. He saw the police pulling back, the blue uniforms disappearing from Malcolm's rallies. He saw the press writing obituaries for a man who was still walking. It gnawed at him. It violated the code. You don't touch a man who speaks truth, even if you don't like the truth he speaks. And more importantly, you don't let outsiders or traitors take down a son of Harlem without permission. Bumpy took it personally. It was an insult to his territory. So the invitation was sent. It had to be analog, no phones, not with the feds listening to every pulse on the wire. It was a word passed from a driver to a barber, from a barber to a waiter, from a waiter to an aide, a whisper in a crowded room. The old man wants to see you, alone, tonight. And that leads us back to the room. The silence. The smoke curling from a cigarette that Bumpy had finally lit, the ember blowing like a dying star in the gloom. "I can put 12 men around your house, Red," Bumpy said, his voice devoid of emotion, purely transactional. "Good men, men who don't sleep, men who don't miss. I can have a car follow your car. I can have a shadow for your shadow. You won't see them, but they will be there. And if anyone steps out of line, if anyone even looks at you wrong, they disappear. No police, no headlines, just gone. The river runs deep, Red." It was the ultimate offer, the sword of Damocles, but held by a friend. Bumpy was offering the full weight of the Harlem underworld, the muscle, the reach, the terror to protect the face of the revolution. It was a merger of dark power and bright light. It was an offer to turn Malcolm X into the most untouchable man in America. Malcolm stared at the table, watching the smoke swirl. He knew Bumpy meant it. He knew that if he said yes, the fear would vanish. He could go home to his wife and children and sleep for the first time in months. He could travel, speak, build his new organization of Afro-American unity without the constant gnawing fear of a shotgun blast from the dark. All he had to do was accept the help of a man the media called a monster. All he had to do was nod. But what Bumpy didn't know, what he couldn't grasp because he operated in a world of absolute pragmatism, was that Malcolm was playing a different game now. He wasn't playing for territory, he was playing for history. "I can't," he whispered. The words hung in the air, fragile as glass. Bumpy didn't blink. He just took a slow drag of his cigarette, the cherry brightening, illuminating the lines on his face. "You can't, or you won't." "If I take your help," Malcolm said, his voice gaining strength, the preacher finding his cadence even in private, "if I surround myself with your soldiers, then I become just another gangster. I validate everything the papers say about me. They call me a thug. They call me a hate monger. If I stand behind your guns, I prove them right. I can't build a righteous movement on a foundation of your violence, Bumpy. It has to be clean. It has to be pure, even if it kills me." This is where everything changed. In that refusal, the tragedy was sealed. Bumpy Johnson, a man who solved every problem with leverage, money, and force, was looking at a problem he couldn't solve. He was looking at a man choosing martyrdom over survival. Bumpy leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking, a sound that seemed incredibly loud in the small room. A rare flash of anger crossed his face, not at Malcolm, but at the waste of it all, at the naivety. "Purity," Bumpy spat the word out like it tasted sour, like spoiled milk. "Purity is for the dead, Red. The living need protection. You think the FBI cares about your purity? You think the men hunting you care that you're righteous? They don't care about your soul. They care about your silence. They have guns. You have words. Words don't stop bullets." "Maybe not," Malcolm replied, finally lifting his head, the light catching the fierce intelligence in his eyes. He looked Bumpy dead in the face. "But words last longer. If I die defending myself with your guns, I die a criminal. If I die defenseless, speaking the truth, then the truth lives forever." The tension in the room shifted. It wasn't fear anymore. It was grief, premature, suffocating grief. Bumpy realized then that he wasn't talking to a man, he was talking to a ghost. He was looking at a dead man walking, and there was nothing his money, his influence, or his razor-blade reputation could do to stop it. He was watching a train wreck in slow motion, standing on the tracks, unable to signal the engineer. He stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, the weight of his years suddenly visible. He walked to the window and looked out at the street below through a crack in the blinds. He saw the gray slush on the sidewalk. He saw a patrol car cruising slowly, shark-like, watching the building. He saw the world that he had conquered, the kingdom he had built on blood and smarts, and he felt entirely, utterly powerless. "You're a fool," Bumpy said to the window, his voice thick. "A brilliant, stubborn fool." "I learned from the best," Malcolm said softly. The meeting didn't end with a handshake. It didn't end with a hug. Those things were too small for this moment. It ended with a resignation. Bumpy turned back to the table. "If you won't take my men, at least take this." He reached into his jacket pocket. He didn't pull out a gun, he didn't pull out a stack of cash. He pulled out a piece of paper with a phone number on it, a private line. If you change your mind, if you see the shadow move and you want to live, call it. Day or night, someone will always answer. Malcolm took the paper. He didn't look at it. He slid it into his pocket next to his heart. Thank you, Bumpy. When Malcolm walked out of that room into the biting cold of the Harlem night, he walked out of the umbrella of protection. He walked into the crosshairs. He walked away from the only army that could have saved him. Bumpy stayed in the chair, sitting in the dark, long after the door had closed. He didn't tap his finger anymore. He just sat, letting the smoke fill the room, mourning the son who wasn't dead yet. What followed is the history we all know, but viewed through a different lens, it becomes a torture session that one man was forced to watch. Weeks passed. The tension in Harlem ratcheted up until the air felt like gasoline. Every time the phone rang in Bumpy's headquarters, he paused. He kept his ear to the ground. He heard the chatter on the street corners. He knew the date was approaching. He heard the rumors of the hit squads coming down from Boston, from Newark. He sent messengers, desperate attempts to force his protection on Malcolm from a distance. He had his men stand guard at rallies uninvited, lurking in the back with hands in their coats. But Malcolm would spot them from the stage, his eyes scanning the crowd, and he would send word to have them removed. He wouldn't let Bumpy save him. It was a dance of death, a stubborn waltz toward the grave. Bumpy grew darker those weeks, short-tempered. He snapped at his captains. He knew what was coming, and the helplessness was eating him alive. He was the king of Harlem, and he couldn't stop a single assassination. Then came February 21st, the Audubon Ballroom. It was a Sunday, cold, gray, the kind of day that feels like a bruise. When the news hit the streets, it didn't travel like a rumor, it traveled like a shock wave. It moved faster than the radio waves. They got him. They got Red. The words moved from stoop to stoop, from bar to bar, carried on the wind of a collective gasp that sucked the oxygen out of the borough. Bumpy Johnson was at the sophisticated Flash Inn, or maybe he was at his desk above the iconic restaurant. The location changes in the telling, but the reaction is always the same. He was playing chess. When the runner burst in, breathless, eyes wide with the horror of what he had just seen, Bumpy didn't look up. They killed him, Bumpy. They shot him on the stage, in front of his kids. Bumpy didn't flip the board. He didn't scream. He simply stopped moving his piece. His hand hovered over a rook, the castle, the fortress. His hand, usually steady as stone, trembled just once. His eyes went distant, seeing that dim room again, seeing the smoke, seeing the young man with the glasses who was too proud to live. The silence that fell over Bumpy Johnson in that moment was terrifying to behold. It was louder than the sirens wailing outside. His lieutenants backed away. They knew that look. It was the look of a man who had been right and hated it more than anything in the world. It was the look of a man who had offered the world and had it rejected. But here is the twist. The quiet, dominant truth that the history books miss. The moment where the script usually calls for war. Bumpy didn't go to war. Everyone expected him to burn down the mosques. Everyone expected a bloodbath in the streets. The young hotheads in his crew were ready. They were strapped. They had the gasoline. They were waiting for the word to turn Harlem into a pyre of vengeance. They wanted to take heads. Bumpy stood up. He looked at his men, their eyes hungry for retribution, and he gave the order that chopped them all. Stand down. But Bumpy, one of them started. I said stand down. Bumpy's voice cracked like a whip. Nobody moves, nobody touches them. Let the police handle it. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't fear. It was the ultimate act of respect. He knew that if he turned Harlem into a war zone in Malcolm's name, he would be doing exactly what Malcolm had refused in that room. He would be staining the legacy with gangster violence. He would be proving the critics right. He would be turning Malcolm X into just another casualty of the street life. So he swallowed the rage. He swallowed the bile. He enforced a calm that was more menacing than any violence could have been. He held back the tide of war with sheer will. He let the police do their work, watching with a cynical eye as they scrambled to cover their tracks, to find their scapegoats, to botch the investigation. But the legend grew. The streets knew. They knew Bumpy had offered. They knew Malcolm had refused. And that knowledge changed how people looked at both men. Malcolm became the saint who walked willingly into the fire, the martyr who chose death over compromise. Bumpy became the silent guardian, the watcher, the man who respected the fire enough not to put it out with blood. It changed Bumpy. The years that followed saw him become more philosophical, more weary. He had seen the limits of his power. He realized that you can control the streets, you can control the numbers, you can control the judges and the politicians, but you cannot control a man's destiny if he is willing to die for it. The meeting in that room was erased from the files. The FBI agents who monitored them surely wrote reports, memos marked top secret, but those reports were likely shredded the moment the bullets flew in the Audubon. It didn't fit the narrative. It humanized the enemy too much. It showed a complexity they wanted to deny. But in the oral history of Harlem, in the barbershops and the back rooms where the real history is kept, the story survived. It serves as a reminder that power is not a monolith. It is fractured. It is personal. True power isn't just about the ability to kill. It is about the ability to foresee the end, to offer a hand to stop it, and the wisdom to accept when that hand is pushed away. It is the heavy burden of being the one left alive to remember. Bumpy Johnson died a few years later, quietly, watching a different world unfold, a world that Malcolm had helped create but never got to see. In the end, the gangster and the prophet were bound not by crime or by cause, but by the shared, silent understanding that in a world built on their destruction, survival itself was the only rebellion that mattered. One chose to survive by any means necessary. The other chose to die to make the survival of others mean something. And somewhere in the silence between those two choices, the truth of Harlem resides. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe for the stories history tried to bury.